Can you please tell us about yourself and your research also? Our viewers and followers would be very much interested in hearing your background as well as your research interests.
Sure, thanks for having me. So I'm Eric Loeb. I'm an associate professor of politics and international relations at Florida International University in Miami. My research broadly looks at the intersection of development and politics in the Middle East and even going beyond the region into the global South. For my earliest or first projects, I really look at the question of how state actors, non-state actors, even quasi-state actors in the region, predominantly Iran and some of the state and non-state actors that it works with or partners with in the Shia world, how they've instrumentalized development as a soft power mechanism to advance their political interests domestically and internationally. So for my book project, I look at Iran's development and aid organization, which is called the Reconstruction Jihad organization. They frame improving development domestically and overseas as almost a sacred struggle or effort in terms of a jihad in a non-military sense. So my book and several articles look at the origins, the evolution of the organization, which was created, even though it imitated or replicated some of the functions, development and aid functions of the Shah, demonstrating some of the continuities pre and post-revolutionary Iran. The organization was officially established in the months after Ayatollah Khomeini comes back to Iran in 1979 and the revolutionary state begins. And it was, as I said, this soft power mechanism that was used to deliver public goods, social services, development projects, and aid to different parts of the countries, which was to improve, of course, the country economically and developmentally, but also to help Ayatollah Khomeini and these new revolutionary elites win hearts and minds, consolidate power domestically. I then look at how once the state does consolidate power in the 1980s, the organization then deploys overseas. It becomes a formal ministry. And it goes to Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, to several countries there. Not surprisingly, it goes to Lebanon, works with Hezbollah on establishing a branch of the organization there and performing similar functions in terms of providing development and aid to Hezbollah's constituents to help it win political support and popular support. And in Africa, it serves this function of helping mitigate the Islamic Republic's diplomatic and international isolation and circumventing economic sanctions and building and expanding diplomatic and commercial relations with countries in Africa. Which have succeeded and failed. However, that's determined to different extents. So that's kind of some of the aspects of my research, and I'm happy to talk about it more if you want.
Very fascinating. I think one thing that I was curious also is about how similar or different that you found comparison of Iranian Development Agency with respect to others, like from the USAID or European development agencies. Can you speak a bit those comparisons, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the development agency, at least when it first started out, or not even when it first, but its early years was very much a faith-based development organization. So, the name of the organization, Jihad, really was again this sacred effort or struggle to develop the country domestically and also countries overseas. There was also a program that the organization had, which may not make it so different from other development organizations. I mean, I've seen, in terms of even though it may be less overt, that there are times when development and humanitarian aid can come with proselytizing or missionary activities, but perhaps less overt than the case of the Iranian organization, where there was, apart from material economic development. Part of its mission in the early years was to also Islamize, the Iranian state as it was transitioning from a secular nationalist monarchy to an Islamic Republic. And so when you look at the organization's development projects in Iran in the early years, it wasn't just about building roads, bridges, hospitals, and schools, and this created debates within the organization because different members had different priorities. But there were also, of course, a conservative wing of the organization, which is very much a microcosm of the Islamic Republic itself, where they wanted to not just focus on infrastructure and other projects, but they wanted to build more mosques and seminaries and congregation halls and coordinate with clerics to deliver sermons and organize prayer groups and study sessions and distribute Qurans and Islamic texts. And they did very similar things with Hezbollah in the Shia territories of Lebanon. Now in Africa, there were more constraints to doing this. There was definitely it depended on the country, it depended on the demographics. There were areas where the organization did this, but it ran into some obstacles, particularly in African countries that were predominantly Sunni or Christian, and that became concerned about these activities. So over time, the organization was less about faith-based development and more about material, humanitarian developmental assistance in terms of trying to help these African economies and trying to have the Islamic Republic establish, diplomatic and commercial inroads in the continent and in these African countries.
Thank you. Very interesting. And coming to the security context and the multipolarity working group, what aspects of the working group did attract your attention, or what was your main motivation for joining forces and developing interest with the multipolarity working group particularly?
Sure. Well, the working group, it's very much an interdisciplinary group with scholars of different disciplines, but similarly looking at issues related to political economy and looking at, shifting balances of power internationally in terms of, how can we think about measuring if the international system is transitioning from a bipolar system to a unipolar system to perhaps now a more multipolar system with rising political and economic powers in the system, in terms of collaborating with scholars in this group and thinking about theoretically, methodologically, how would we go about doing that. And for me, I bring a specific aspect in terms of looking at not just Iran, but Middle Eastern developmental relations between the Middle East and other parts of the global South, like Sub-Saharan Africa. Other scholars come at this from a different perspective. So for me, at least, it's an opportunity to learn or to explore more deeply, theoretical frameworks, methodologies that can answer some of these questions. Other questions that interest me too are when you look at, for example, dependency theory or world systems theory, there's, again, this emphasis on dynamics, power dynamics between the global North and the global South, which of course is not such a clean-cut binary. I mean, world systems theory talks about periphery, semi-periphery. There, of course, have been now rising powers in the global South. But my research has taken me to these broader questions of what do South-South cooperation look like. So, for example, Iranian and Middle Eastern intervention or relations with countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. What do those types of cooperation look like, those relations look like on the different levels of diplomacy, trade, security, commerce, even ideology and culture? What are the power dynamics that exist there? Because of course these countries are not always on the same playing field. But even, recipient or beneficiary countries, vis-a-vis donors have agency of their own, right? So how do they assert or exert their agency? We see that African countries, as they did during the Cold War vis-a-vis the U.S. and the Soviet Union, can play Middle Eastern countries off of each other to put themselves in a more optimal position. So looking at, not just the interventions or these relations between donor and recipient, but also looking at agency and bidirectionality on both sides, I think are also interesting questions. And I think members of the group can contribute to those discussions.